Here
David
at the
Bromstad
Maricopa
walks onto
County
every
Home
set
Show
the
is
same way. Shoulders
kind of
back,
epic.
colors
I've never been
loud,
treated so
smile
much.
wider than the room. Millions of people watching feel something warm, something safe, something almost electric the moment he appears. What they don't see is the boy who once sat in a Minnesota cafeteria while 600 classmates stood up in a coordinated act designed to leave him with nowhere to look and no way out. What they don't see is the young animator who gave years of training to a dream job only to lose it to a corporate memo he never saw coming. What they don't see is the man who woke up one day to find someone he had trusted completely attempting to dismantle his reputation in open court, using the most intimate details of his life as ammunition. Joy didn't come easily for David Bromstad. He excavated it from years of rubble, one deliberate choice at a time. Cokato, Minnesota is the kind of small town where deviation from expectation draws attention fast, and where conformity gets enforced not through rules but through atmosphere. David grew up in a conservative Scandinavian American household where emotions stayed tidy, ambition stayed practical, and artistic sensitivity in a boy was treated as something to correct. From a very early age, he stood apart, drawn to color the way other kids were drawn to sport, more comfortable with a sketchbook than anything the town considered worthwhile, more interested in how a room made someone feel than in any pursuit that earned approval. That difference, quiet and persistent, was going to cost him more than he could have imagined. Teasing had already accumulated across years by the time high school arrived, but one specific afternoon in the school cafeteria moved past anything bullying usually is into something far more deliberately brutal. Over 600 students, effectively the entire school, stood up simultaneously and made obscene gestures at him, and none of that was the worst part. The worst part was the principal. The one adult in that building whose entire purpose was to protect students stood there and participated, and whether he got swept up in the moment or simply didn't care what he was reinforcing, his presence transformed the event into something that carried the weight of an institutional verdict. You do not belong here, and nobody who matters disagrees. David described that period in a 2008 interview with Out magazine as living in daylight hell, and the phrase earns its precision because hell is a place with no exit and no one coming to help, and daylight means it all happened in plain sight while nothing was done about it. No teacher intervened, no counselor followed up, no adult treated what had happened as something requiring any response at all. The hallways became something to endure. The cafeteria became a space loaded with dread every single morning, and David turned progressively inward, stopping to expect protection from adults and finding instead the only territory that remained entirely his. A blank page and whatever colors happened to be within reach. What art gave David during those years wasn't expression in the way that word usually gets used. It was protection. A sketchbook couldn't be turned against him, a painting couldn't mock him, and the interior world of whatever he was creating couldn't be invaded by the crowd that controlled everything outside it. Color became loaded with a significance it would carry for the rest of his life. Each saturated, deliberate choice, a quiet act of resistance against the grayness being forced on him from outside. The bright, defiant palettes that would later become his trademark on national television weren't the product of a naturally cheerful personality. They were the language a targeted, isolated teenager developed in private because creating something vivid was the only thing that reliably pushed the darkness back. Viewers who admired the boldness of his design choices on HGTV were, without knowing it, watching the long aftermath of that period. Survival translated into aesthetics, pain converted into color. After high school, David made the kind of decision that requires real courage when you've already been told, repeatedly and publicly, that who you are is wrong. He applied to Ringling College of Art and Design in Sarasota, Florida, a school known specifically for its relationship with Disney's animation department, and committed to becoming exactly what the people in that cafeteria would have found most ridiculous. For someone whose most obvious characteristic had been used as justification for years of cruelty, betting everything on it wasn't a rational calculation. It was closer to a refusal finally, to let them determine the shape of his future. Ringling was where David thrived in the way that people do when they finally land in an environment that matches who they actually are. His creativity wasn't a liability there. It was the entire point. After graduating, he secured the job that had driven every choice he'd made since committing to art, a position in Disney's animation department surrounded by people whose standards matched his own, doing work that validated every year of training and every moment of doubt he had pushed through to get there. The dark years in Minnesota receded. The boy who had been publicly humiliated now had an answer, not in words, but in the simple fact of where he was and what he was doing. And then the ground shifted. CGI was replacing hand-drawn animation at a pace the industry hadn't prepared for, and Disney reorganized on a scale that left entire departments obsolete almost overnight. David's position was among those eliminated, not because of any failure on his part, but because of a technological transition that had everything to do with timing and nothing to do with talent. The professional loss was real, but the personal damage was heavier because that job had been evidence that he was good enough, creative enough, worthy of the life he had built, and when it disappeared, the doubt accumulated in those Minnesota years came surging back. He drifted financially and emotionally for a time before turning toward interior design, not as a calculated pivot, but as the natural extension of everything he had always known how to do. He started small, taking on children's rooms at modest rates with no established client base and no guarantee of where any of it was heading, driven by the same instinct that had pulled him to his sketchbook during the worst years of adolescence. It didn't require certainty, it just required continuing. A friend persuaded David to audition for HGTV's Design Star in 2006, and he went in without high expectations, still carrying the weight of the Disney chapter and the self-doubt that had accumulated long before it. But on camera, something happened that disappointment hadn't managed to extinguish. His warmth, his humor, his complete inability to make interior design feel inaccessible. All of it came through without effort or performance. He won. That win opened a door that led eventually to My Lottery Dream Home and to the version of David Bromstad that millions of Americans would come to recognize over the years that followed. My Lottery Dream Home was always more than a real estate program. It was a platform for a personality shaped by very specific circumstances, and the enthusiasm David brought to every episode, the genuine delight at a bold tile choice, the real excitement about a bedroom with a view, was rooted in an understanding of what it actually means to finally have a space that feels like it belongs to you. He had spent years looking for that feeling himself, and he knew exactly what it was worth. By 2015, the public image looked polished and stable, and that's when Jeffrey Glasko filed a civil lawsuit in a Florida state court. Glasko, David's former long-term partner, made allegations constructed to inflict maximum damage, claims involving financial misconduct, illegal substances, and the hiring of male escorts, presented in language explicit enough to guarantee tabloid coverage and loaded enough to invite public speculation. Comment sections filled immediately. The contrast between the cheerful television host and the chaos described in the filing was too dramatic not to generate discussion, and the discussion wasn't kind. David said almost nothing, no public statement, no media appearances, no social media response. He let the legal process run without attempting to manage perception alongside it. For anyone watching from outside, the silence read as either strategically disciplined or deeply suspicious. In hindsight, it was the decision of someone who had already survived one orchestrated public humiliation and had no intention of participating in another, someone who had learned that defending yourself loudly in public rarely changes what the public has already decided to believe. The court dismissed the case entirely in April 2016 and ordered Glasko to pay David's legal fees, finding that the lawsuit had constituted an abuse of the legal system. David's legal team described the claims as the work of a desperate individual seeking to cause embarrassment, and David's own public response amounted to a single sentence on Instagram: that silence in certain moments is the most powerful thing available. What a legal dismissal cannot address, though, is the specific grief of being attacked by someone you once trusted completely. The outcome was clean, the personal reality was not. None of that difficulty arrived in isolation either. In early 2015, his close friend Greg Girard suffered a sudden hemorrhagic stroke, and David flew to his side, organized a fundraising effort, and spent months posting updates about the recovery with the attention of someone who understood exactly how much the small victories mattered. While that was still ongoing, David's father landed in the hospital with a dangerously irregular heartbeat, a resting rate of 136 beats per minute, with doctors monitoring closely for the risk of seizure and stroke. David left work, sat in a hospital, and posted with the same honesty he brought to everything else: his father's failing heart valves, the irregular rhythm, the long uncertainty of not knowing what came next. On screen, he was still the cheerful host of a show about lottery winners building dream lives. In waiting rooms, he was just a person afraid of losing someone he loved. Those simultaneous crises reshaped how David measured anything. Success stopped being countable, and showing up became the standard. for people who needed him, and for himself. He started building a life that could actually sustain the weight of everything he had already survived, more intentional about health, more selective about where his energy went, more honest in quiet ways about what the polished, visible version of himself didn't show. In May 2025, he posted a photograph of himself reclining with a nasal oxygen tube in place and offered no caption, no explanation. Fans who had watched him navigate one private crisis after another assumed immediately that something serious was being concealed, and the concern that filled his comments was real. 24 hours later, David clarified that the tube was part of hyperbaric oxygen therapy, a recovery and wellness treatment increasingly common among athletes and performers focused on long-term physical maintenance. He wasn't sick. He was doing in public what he had been doing privately for some time, managing his own health with the same precision and intentionality he brought to everything else. His home in Winter Park, Florida, which he designed himself, is less a portfolio piece than a personal record. Every color chosen for a reason, every object carrying specific weight, the whole space functioning as evidence of what it looks like when someone stops building for approval and starts building something true. As HGTV's first openly gay host in the context of home design and lifestyle television, he never performed his identity or made it the center of his brand, but he never concealed it either. He existed, loudly, colorfully, without apology, in an industry that had historically preferred its stars palatable and private, and that consistency, sustained across 2 decades without ever needing to announce itself, became quietly one of the more meaningful things he did. David Bromstad's story doesn't resolve anywhere clean, and pain and success kept arriving together long after the point where most public narratives would have wrapped up. What stays constant across all of it is the choice, made repeatedly, in circumstances that would have justified a different decision, to continue. The boy who survived a cafeteria by turning to a sketchbook grew into a man who turned his entire life into an act of sustained creative resilience, and every room he designed, every episode he filmed, every color he chose, every honest moment he shared when the polished version would have been easier, all of it is the same refusal, repeated across decades, color against darkness, presence against erasure, survival translated into something beautiful and entirely, unmistakably his own.